I am here to welcome you to our third keynote on the Saturday morning. And we have already had two beautiful and engaging conference days, and I'm really looking forward to the events on this third day. And thank you for coming out in the morning. So before we get started, one organizational note. If you've been joining the keynotes online before, you already know this, but I'm going to repeat it. Of course, if you're in the room, you can ask questions in the Q&A after, but also if you're following the keynote on YouTube, you can ask questions. There's a link to slido.com right below the video. You can just click on that, then you type in your question, and then we will receive it here in the room, and we can ask your question, or I can ask your question for you. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our third keynote speaker, Joshua Trey Barnett. He is assistant professor in the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences at Pennsylvania State University, where he holds a joint appointment at the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences, and he's also affiliated with the Sustainability Institute there. Before that, he was assistant professor of communication at the University of Duluth in Minnesota, as well as a research associate at their Institute on the Environment. He received his PhD from the University of Utah with a dissertation on mortal assemblages, rhetorics of ecology and death, which looks at shifts in rhetoric and practices of death care and how these shifts indicate changes in how we think about the category of the human. So here we already have some of the themes that then became central to his further research. He is the author of Mourning in the Anthropocene, Ecological Grief and Earthly Coexistence, which came out in 2022 with Michigan State University Press, and which won the Charlie Peterson Award, Book Award in Environmental Communication from the National Communication Association in 2022. So in this work, he looks into, quote, some of the ways we are moved and might move others, not only to notice those more than human beings and ways of being that have been or might be lost, but also to regard them as worthy of our grief and thus of our care. And this is a quote from the introduction of the book. And he focuses in particular on the contributions of rhetoric and the rhetorical conditions of ecological grief, specifically by considering practices of naming, archiving, and making visible. And I just want to add that in addition, of course, to the fact that I'm very interested also in questions of grievability myself, I really enjoyed the way this book is written, because it's very accessible also for someone like me who's not a specialist in rhetoric. And it really carefully navigates through rhetoric as a cultural practice that is intricately connected to matters of care, which, and also at all times it's being attentive to some of the profound differences we have to take into account, for example, considering practices and relations of indigenous place naming versus settler colonial naming practices. So questions of ecological feelings and rationality, of care, but also of violence, and significantly the role of rhetoric and connection to these questions are really at the core of his research as well as his teaching. In addition to his monograph, Professor Barnett has published numerous book chapters and articles that inquire into different aspects of ecological care and the role of forms of communication from rhetoric to media. There's too many to list them all, so I'll just name a few titles so that you get an impression. So there's, for example, an article on thinking ecologically with Judith Butler that appeared in 2018 in Culture, Theory, and Critique. In 2020, he published a chapter on grievable water, Mourning the Animus River, in a collection on water rhetoric and social justice. In 2021, he published an article on rhetoric for earthly coexistence, Imagining an Ecocentric Rhetoric, in Rhetoric and Public Affairs. And just out this year is an article on ecological care's compromised conditions, reflections from Cook Forest, that appeared in Essays in Philosophy. And he's also currently working on two further book projects, an edited collection entitled Ecological Feelings, a rhetorical compendium, and a monograph about rhetoric, care, and violence in ecological worlds. So from this selection of a much longer list of his research and publications, you can see why he's really an excellent speaker to have with us this morning to think through connections between ecological citizenship and care. And he's going to do this with and through Hannah Arendt's late writings on the activities of thinking and judging. And so I'm very much looking forward to his talk, which is entitled Casting One's Lot, Environmental Citizenship and the Trouble with Care. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joshua Trey Barnett.
Okay, thank you, Linda, for that. Can you all hear me? It sounds very quiet up here. Thank you for that really lovely, generous introduction. Thank you to Heike for the invitation, and to Heike and Katja for organizing this fantastic inter- and transdisciplinary symposium. I've learned quite a bit over the last couple of days and have had many thoughts provoked, and I can only hope to try to provoke a few thoughts for you this morning. As Linda said, my first book was entitled Mourning in the Anthropocene, and by the time I finished writing that book, I was beginning to think about the relationship between grief and care, and about the ways in which grief and care interanimate one another as practices of everyday life and of earthly coexistence. And so, in fact, the epilogue to that book is called Caring Rhetorics, and works through a number of questions about the relationship between grief and care. But I have to say that at the time that I was writing that chapter, I was really in the eco-grief world and not in the eco-care world. And so I had a fairly simple, not very complicated, and some might even say naive conception of care as a kind of uncomplicated good, right? We ought to care, and care is a good thing, and care is what sustains the world and other beings and ways of being, and so we ought to pursue it. And I still think that, as you'll see today, but I also have a far more complicated or messy understanding of this conception of care, which has come out of a lot of reading of the ethics of care literature, which has been developing in a very robust way for the past 40 or so years across disciplines, but particularly led by feminist scholars and philosophy and political theory and other important disciplines. And as a rhetorical scholar, I've also been very interested in exhortations to care. And I'm happy to talk about this a little bit in the Q&A, but practically and politically, my thinking about care was complicated in the States by exhortations to care for natural places by killing invasive species, right? So what does it mean, I wondered, and I've been trying to puzzle through this, that so often in the States we are commanded by governments and conservation organizations and maybe even friends and family to do quite a bit of harm and quite a bit of violence in the name of care. What does that mean for us ethically and politically? And so I have a more complicated sense of care. So I want to hang on to care, but I want to do so without romanticizing it. And so that's really where the talk is coming from today. And I'm going to try to answer some of the questions, or at least approach some of the questions about care with two thinkers. There's kind of one on each shoulder who have, influencing me and whispering in my ear. One of those happens to be an American ecologist named Aldo Leopold, who I'm going to talk about here at the forefront of the talk. And the other one happens to be German political theorist Hannah Arendt, who you all probably know much better than I do. So I will welcome your thoughts and ideas about my interpretation of her work. So, okay, now on to the talk. In the final and best-known chapter of his 1949 book, A Sand County Almanac, the American ecologist and author Aldo Leopold sketches what he calls the land ethic, which is an alternative to the view that decisions about how humans ought to relate to more than human beings and ways of being can and ought to be settled by economic calculations alone. I've heard a lot about that over the last couple of days. Among the crucial starting points of Leopold's alternative ethic is the fact that humans tend to live in community, which he in fact understands as the raison d'etre of all ethics. According to Leopold, though, prior ethics have been based on a too narrow conception of community, one that encompassed humans and humans alone. The land ethic, Leopold contends, simply enlarges the boundary. I love simply. Simply enlarges the boundaries. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. Humans remain a part of this more expansive community, to be sure, but only a part. A land ethic, Leopold continues, changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. From conqueror to plain member and citizen. And it follows from this, Leopold reasons, that humans owe to our fellow members and to the community as such a level of respect, this is his word, respect, that will ensure the continued existence. Again, his words, the continued existence of each. Leopold, of course, did not always harbor such views. He came to them rather by way of decades of observation and reflection, by way, that is, of his own experiences. And in another of his better-known essays, this one entitled Thinking Like a Mountain, do you all know Leopold? Yeah? In these two essays? Ah, very good. Some of you. Okay, so in another of his best-known essays, this one entitled Thinking Like a Mountain, Leopold recounts and reflects on one of those experiences. There, Leopold recalls an incident that occurred around 1909, not all that long after he graduated from Yale University's fledgling forestry school. He was among the first graduates. And his first job took him to Apache National Forest in what was then still the Arizona Territory. One day, while conducting reconnaissance in the Blue Range, which is a mountain range, Leopold and his companion were eating lunch on a high rim rock when they noticed a commotion in the river valley below. At first glance, they thought it was a deer fording the rushing river, but on second glance, they realized it was not a deer, but a wolf. Soon, Leopold says, a pile of wolves appeared in an open flat where they writhed and tumbled in a welcoming melee of wagging tails and playful maulings. And yet the play fighting did not last long. If you've read the essay, you remember what happens next, and here's how Leopold describes it. In those days, we had never heard of passing up a chance to kill a wolf. In a second, we were pumping lead into the pack, but with more excitement than accuracy. How to aim a steep downhill shot is always confusing. When our rifles were empty, he continues, the old wolf was down, and a pup was dragging a leg into impassable slide rocks. Out of ammunition, the two men descended from their high perch to inspect the casualties. We reached the old wolf, Leopold says in a very famous line, just in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. The sight of the old wolf dying, as Leopold tells the story, set a thought train into motion. I realized then, he writes, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes. The story is, to some degree, a familiar one. As the saying goes, we often do not know or appreciate what we have until we have lost it. Seeing the old wolf perish, Leopold saw anew. Before, he says, he was content to act upon the prevailing view that wolves were unredeemable predators. After, he reports, he could no longer go along with the status quo. Now, Leopold was, of course, a sentimental person, a fact that is, I think, on display on most, if not all, pages of his Sam County Almanac, and it's hard not to detect a hint of that sentimentality here, but he also goes on, and I think that this is key, to describe where the thought train that began that day would take him over the next several decades. Since then, Leopold writes, I have lived to see state after state extirpate its wolves. I have watched the face of many a newly wolfless mountain, and I have seen the south-facing slopes wrinkle with a maze of new deer trails. I have seen every edible bush and seedling browsed, first to anemic desuetude and then to death. I have seen every edible tree defoliated to the height of a saddle horn. Only after witnessing the changes wrought upon the landscape by the eradication of wolves did Leopold confirm his initial sense, and this is the word he uses, that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with his earlier views. That neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed. These experiences and the thoughts they surely sparked changed Leopold. If he was once all too pleased to expel some beings and ways of being from what he would later call the land community, by the time he wrote Thinking Like a Mountain, he had come to see wolves, much like human beings, as plain members and citizens of the land community. Which brings me back to Leopold's conception of the land ethic, and in particular to his explanation of why humans need to see themselves, why we need to see ourselves, not as conquerors, but rather as part and parcel of land communities constituted by a plurality of beings and ways of being, human and more than human alike. It's not merely for Leopold that the conqueror role, as he calls it, is intrinsically domineering and thus prone to dominate and oppress others. That would be bad enough. But it is also the case, Leopold writes, that the conqueror role is eventually self-defeating. And it is self-defeating because it is premised on hubris rather than humility. It is implicit in such a role, Leopold writes, that the conqueror knows ex cathedra just what makes the community clock tick. It is implicit in such a role that the conqueror knows just what makes the community clock tick, and just what and who is valuable, and what and who is worthless in community life. And, Leopold concludes, it always turns out that he knows neither. Whereas the conqueror seems to know in advance how the land community works, which beings and ways of being ought to be protected, and which can and perhaps even should be destroyed, the plain member and citizen that Leopold hopes we will all become lacks all such certainties. To be sure, such ecological citizens make decisions regarding just who and what warrants their caring attention and labor, but they do so without the reassuring notion that they are merely doing what is right. In his essay on the land ethic, Leopold shines a light on the sort of thinking that makes self-assurance so hard to come by for the ecological citizen. This biological citizen, as he sometimes calls it, quits thinking about decent land use as solely an economic problem, and instead examines such questions in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. As they turn such questions over and over again, what is ethically right? What is aesthetically right? What is economically expedient? As they turn such questions over and over again, the ecological citizen's only handrail is the general idea that, as Leopold puts it, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it is wrong when it tends otherwise. So that's the closest we get to a maxim. But, then again, what constitutes integrity, stability, and beauty are always in some sense up for debate and deliberation, negotiation, and renegotiation, which is one of the reasons why Leopold insists that the land ethic will forever be in the making. It will, to echo his Darwinian terminology, continue to evolve as ecological citizens continue to think anew what it means to dwell on Earth with others. Leopold's experience with the wolves taught him an important lesson, namely that one's sense of who and what is worthy of care can shift considerably with time, experience, and circumstance. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why he calls for humility and curiosity throughout his Sand County Almanac. It is, for Leopold, always possible to care otherwise, and to care even for beings and ways of being that one once relegated to the realm of disposability. To be sure, this contingency does not stop Leopold from making up his mind moment to moment, day to day, about just who and what is worthy of his care, nor does it lead him to throw up his hands and to renounce all responsibility to others, human or more than human. Still, it does move him, I think, to approach questions about care patiently, cautiously, thoughtfully, in a word, carefully. In thinking about care, I follow the lead not only of Leopold, but also of scholars like Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, Tom Van Doren, and Donna Haraway, each of whom refuses to conceive of care as an uncritical good, while at the same time insisting that care, in all its complexity, in all its ambiguity, in all its ambivalence, remains necessary for those of us engaged in the ongoing work of earthly coexistence. For example, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, in her book Matters of Care, affirms on the one hand that, and these are her words, care is a necessary practice, a life-sustaining activity, an everyday constraint, and, on the other, that care is no innocent activity, that it cannot be purged from its predicaments. These are difficult truths that live alongside one another, neither one canceling out the other. Just because care happens to be necessary to sustain living beings and lively entities does not mean that its enactment is always good, much less good for everyone or everything. And similarly, just because care is never innocent, never entirely distinguishable from harm and even from violence, does not mean that we can or should or could try to do without care. We have rather to reconcile ourselves with these incommensurable qualities of care. So, care is necessary, care is fraught. And one among many reasons why care is fraught is that it is, as numerous care theorists have contended, relational and so specific. Care is, in other words, always situated and particular. And so, while we may affirm what the political theorist Joan Tronto describes as a universal imperative, namely that we should care, and she indeed says we ought to affirm this universal imperative, at the same time we do well not to lose sight of the fact that when principle is forced to give way to practice, we care not in general but always in particular, for particular others under particular conditions. One cares not for all children, for example, but for this child. Not for all patients, but for this patient. Not for all students, but for this student. And so, too, when we broaden our scope beyond the human, one does not care for all plants, but these plants. Not for all animals, but these animals. Not for all ecosystems, but for these ecosystems. Yet even this characterization is somewhat misleading, for plant and animal and ecosystem are themselves abstractions. Our caring deeds can, of course, be oriented toward and even organized by such abstractions. Think, for example, about the way that conservation biologists seek to protect and preserve species. Right? So species is a guiding concept. So our caring deeds can be oriented toward and organized by these kinds of abstractions, but our concrete acts of care, our caring deeds, are themselves always directed toward specific beings and ways of being. And over and beyond the consequences care might have for these abstractions, it is always the ongoingness of specific beings and ways of being that is at stake in care. But care is fraught for yet other reasons, including the fact that needs for care are infinite, particularly when we recognize that needs emanate not only from human others, and from the fact that our capacity, individually and collectively, to respond to and meet those needs is, by contrast, finite. Writing only of the needs for care that humans exhibit, Tronto notes that there will always and inevitably be more care needs than can be met. There will always be more needs than can be met, which means that in meeting some needs, other needs will inevitably go unmet. We can only care about and for so much, in other words. I say care about and for to mark what seems to me an important distinction. To care about someone or something is to feel concern or affection for them, as well as to devote some measure of one's attention to them. We can, I suspect, care about much more, or many more, than we can care for. For to care for someone or something is not only to be oriented toward them in such a way that one hopes or strives to support their ongoingness. To care for another is also to engage in the time and energy and resource-consuming activities that in fact do safeguard those others about whom and which one cares. And because one's time, energy, and resources are necessarily limited, so too is one's ability to care for others, even sometimes for those that one cares about. To make matters still a bit more complicated, caring needs sometimes also conflict with one another. It may be that such needs conflict temporally, that is, two or more beings or ways of being need care now, right? They both need care now or at some specific moment in time. And to be sure, it's not necessarily this temporal co-occurrence of caring needs that constitutes conflict, right? It's instead the fact that potential carers can only be in one place at one time, caring for one being or way of being at one time. And of course, if there are enough carers to go around, that sort of conflict can, at least in theory, be resolved by distributing the caring labor. There's been a whole lot of work in care theory, for example, about how to scale care up, make it public, make it political, to redistribute some of these caring labors. So that conflict is not, at least in theory, irresolvable, but there is also a sense in which caring needs may conflict not temporally, but in principle. And this is far more complicated. Here we arrive at a far more profound kind of trouble. Sometimes what is good for X may turn out to be bad for Y. Sometimes what is good for X may turn out to be bad for Y, where X and Y can represent either concrete individuals, say, this deer or this wolf in the river valley, as well as abstractions, say, this species or this ecosystem, this land community. And so much depends on who or what one sees as the primary subject of one's care. In a world of countless needs, Toronto reminds us the problem of determining which needs should be met is inescapable. It never goes away. There's always a question, right? If I care about X and so attempt to care for X, my care for X may well move me to harm Y or to expose Y to harms. In his book Flightways, for example, the ecological philosopher Tom Van Doren characterizes some of the tensions that can emerge in the worlds of wildlife conservation. Focusing on the story of the American whooping crane, which was nearly pushed over the edge of extinction in the early 20th century, Van Doren notes how captive breeding programs tend to care about and for species first. Right? So this is the sort of conservation biology approach. It is, after all, the species that such programs seek to safeguard against loss. But, Van Doren shows us, protecting the species often requires engaging with individuals. And as Van Doren notes, what is good for the species happens in this case not always to be good for those individuals. Keeping individual cranes in captivity and forcing them to reproduce and to interact with humans throughout their lives, for instance, may be necessary for keeping the species going, yet they also expose the individual cranes to a myriad of harms. To care for the species, in this case, entails, perhaps even requires, subjecting individuals to violence. And of course, and Van Doren doesn't really talk about this, but it also means that the conservationists who are engaged in this work also find that they have to become the sort of person, who will sacrifice the one for the other. In order to do good, in other words, we sometimes find that we must do bad. And that's really what I talk about in the essay that Linda mentioned that just came out in Essays in Philosophy, is what it means to try to care in these really compromised conditions in which caring often requires that we do all sorts of things that we might otherwise not wish to do or might not otherwise think of as good or caring. Compromised conditions often lead to compromised care. Okay, so all this trouble is troublingly endemic to caring relations. We can neither wish nor will our way out of these vexing conditions. Rather, as plain members and citizens of more than human communities, we're called to muddle through such ethical quandaries and to do so without relinquishing the responsibilities that participation in any community brings forth. The philosopher Donna Haraway captures well, I believe, the complexities of caring amid such compromised and compromising conditions. In When Species Meet, for instance, Haraway argues that giving up human exceptionalism entails curiosity and commitment. And if you remember that last chapter of When Species Meet, where it's called Parting Bites, and she's talking about a number of meals that she had, we could talk about it in the Q&A. But that's the context for this comment. She says, giving up human exceptionalism entails curiosity and commitment. One must, she says, both, these are her words, know more at the end of the day than at the beginning. We have to know more at the end of the day than at the beginning, and yet also cast oneself with some ways of life and not others. We have to know more at the end of the day than at the beginning, and we also have to cast ourselves with some ways of life and not others. And we have to do so, or we ought to do so, Haraway argues, without ever letting ourselves feel self-certain, self-assured. Similarly, in Staying with the Trouble, Haraway declares that the doings of situated actual human beings matter. It matters with which ways of living and dying we cast our lot rather than others, and it matters not just to human beings, but to all the many more than human beings and ways of being with whom and with which we share the earth. Like it or not, Haraway writes, we are in the string figure game of caring for and with precarious worldlings. So all of that sort of nest of complications is what I'm trying to evoke with the phrase trouble, the trouble with care, right? Is that it is this troubled and troubling and yet necessary part of life on earth with others. Still, though, the question remains. If it matters with whom and with what we cast ourselves, if it matters for whom and what we care, how then do we decide? Wolf, deer, ecosystem, how do we decide with whom and with what to cast our lot? What prepares us to decide, to make up our minds, as Haraway puts it, to cast our lot with some beings and ways of being, some ways of living and dying, rather than others? Right? Rather than others. In the same chapter of Staying with the Trouble, in which she claims that humans cannot help but care for some rather than others, some and not others, she slips into a hortatory mode. Think we must. We must think, exclamation point. Think we must think. Versions of this call to think appear at least 9 times throughout the chapter. Time and again, I had gone back to the chapter for the casting our lot quote, and then I read the whole thing again, and I realized that really the chapter is about thinking. It's fantastic to go back to these things again and again and find something different. So time and again, facing the complexities of caring for human and more than human others, Haraway turns to thinking, not as a way out of the quandaries of earthly coexistence, but rather, for her, as the only ethical way through them. Think we must think. And so it is to thinking that I now want to turn. But not before circling back round to Leopold once more. It's by no means insignificant, I think, that he titled the essay about his encounter with the wolves that fateful day, Thinking Like a Mountain. The phrase appears twice, once in the title and once in a phrase near the end of the essay. Leopold never stops to explain what it means or what he's trying to evoke by it, relying instead on readers' ability to make inferences based on his descriptions. Its meaning is implicit, for example, in the following line, which I read earlier. But after seeing the green fire die, Leopold sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view, namely the view that wolves are disposable. To think like a mountain is, it seems, to think from the perspective of a mountain or mountains. But of course, this requires fashioning a perspective. We cannot know whether mountains think, nor if they can think what they do or would think or are thinking. And yet, Leopold suggests we can nevertheless try to think like a mountain. We can, that is, try to see things from a standpoint radically other than the one we happen to occupy. In the one passage where the phrase does appear in the essay, it functions still less literally. After suggesting that mountains probably live in mortal fear of their deer, Leopold shifts his attention to cows and to the ranchers who attempt to protect their herd from predators. The cowman, Leopold notes, who cleans his range of wolves does not realize that he is taking over the wolf's job of trimming the herd to fit the range because he has not learned to think like a mountain. He has not, in other words, learned to think like an ecosystem, or to use Leopold's felicitous phrase, a land community. And so it turns out that thinking like a mountain means not only thinking from the standpoint of some specific more than human other, but from the standpoints of a plurality of others, the standpoints, that is, of the other plain members and citizens of the land community, and thus, for Leopold, of the community as such, which is never one, but always many. The sort of thinking in which Leopold was engaged, this thinking like a mountain, is, if you will permit me to make a very large leap, precisely the sort of thinking that the political theorist Hannah Arendt said that Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, had not or could not or would not engage in. Of course, Arendt encountered Eichmann at his trial in Jerusalem, and although she was there as a reporter for The New Yorker, she was also curious about Eichmann, the person, the man who orchestrated the deaths of so many millions. What was he like personally? She had expected him to conform to stereotypes of infamous evildoers, but what she observed, she remembers in The Life of the Mind, was a, quote, manifest shallowness that made it impossible to trace the uncontestable evil of his deeds to any deeper level of roots or motives. Eichmann spoke, she writes, in cliches and stock phrases. He could easily rattle off all sorts of conventional ideas, including Kant's categorical imperative, and indeed he typically explained his actions in terms of the conventions of his day. He was, as he was quick to claim throughout his trial, simply following the rules that were handed down to him. Strictly speaking, he claimed he had committed no crime. For Arendt, these kinds of assertions were evidence not of a deep-seated or radical evil, but of something far more sinister, namely thoughtlessness. As she reports in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, Eichmann's inability to speak, by which I think Arendt meant speak meaningfully, was closely connected with an inability to think. But it was not just that Eichmann could not or had not thought. The real problem, Arendt says, is that he had not or had refused to think from the standpoint of somebody else. So it's an inability to think, and then she qualifies. It's an inability to think from the standpoint of somebody else. This encounter with Eichmann prompted Arendt to think, of course, extensively about the act of thinking, but also and relatedly about the relationship between thoughtlessness and evil-doing, as well as about the relationship between thinking and ethics. Arendt understands thinking, first of all, as an activity that begins with experience. All thought, as she writes in The Life of the Mind, arises out of experience. This is important. It means that however abstract thinking may become, it has its origins, its roots, so to speak, in lived experience, in the stuff of everyday life. And yet, somehow, paradoxically, Arendt says, thinking requires that we also withdraw from that stream of experience and what she calls the world of appearances. In some sense, withdrawal is impossible, I would say. No matter how hard one tries to retreat, one finds that one is still somehow here in the world with others. Life, as it were, goes on. So one must find a way to withdraw from worldly life from within worldly life. One must, as it were, retreat into oneself. And what does one do once one has withdrawn? Arendt says that thinking consists in a soundless dialogue. When thinking, Arendt argues, one carries on a conversation with oneself, in which, as she puts it, I am both the one who asks and the one who answers. Beginning with experience, the thinking self goes back and forth, questioning and examining whatever has occurred, only to question and examine some more. Its aim is not knowledge, but meaning. Searching for some kind of language to describe this experience of thinking, this activity of thinking, Arendt famously makes use of an atmospheric metaphor. When we are not thinking, she says, matters remain settled. When we are not thinking, matters remain settled. During such periods of thoughtlessness, which she says are exceedingly common, we simply take for granted the established ways of naming and categorizing and appraising and so forth. Thoughtlessness, in other words, sustains a kind of calm. So long as one is not thinking, one remains, as she says, protected from reality. In contrast, Arendt writes of the wind of thought, which blows through and disturbs this calm. And this is so because thinking, acted out as it is in a kind of questioning, tends to unsettle. When we begin to think, we bring with us terms and concepts and ideas, of course, and initially we may feel that we have a firm grasp on such things. But the wind of thought, she says, sweeps through and whisks them out of our hands. So too with rules. Whatever seems so clearly right or wrong or necessary during periods of thoughtlessness may well come to seem, at least while one is thinking, less certainly good or right or necessary. The wind of thought leaves whatever seemed settled in disarray. Or, as Arendt puts it, thinking inevitably has a destructive, undermining effect on all established criterias, values, measurements of good and evil, in short, on those customs and rules of conduct we treat of in morals and ethics. Which is why Arendt links thoughtlessness to evildoing. When we are not thinking, she says, we tend to accept what is given without question, without critique. Unthinking, we usually are content to go along, to go with the flow, to follow the rules, to do as we're told. Non-thinking, as Arendt understood it, teaches people to, quote, hold fast to whatever the prescribed rules of conduct may be at a given time in a given society. When murdering Jews became the law of the land in Germany, she says, Eichmann, devoted to his career and social standing and not thinking, simply followed orders. Had he thought about what he was doing, what he was being asked to do, Arendt surmises that Eichmann might have decided to resist. Of course, it's hard to know whether Arendt was right on this score, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence that she was not. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that thinking remains one of the only safeguards, at least for individuals, but perhaps also for communities, against the sort of somnambulism that permits and even encourages us to do as we are told, to follow those rules, to obey those laws, to do the right thing so long as right aligns with the perspective of whatever the powers that be happen to be at a given moment in a given place. In contrast, thinking, and particularly this thinking from different standpoints, tends to inculcate a kind of uncertainty, almost unease about what one knows, about what one can know, about how one can know, and about what to do, about how to conduct oneself in the face of the myriad peculiarities that emerge in the course of one's life. And this was, as I said earlier, the kind of thinking in which Leopold engaged following his encounter with the wolves in Arizona. Watching the old wolf die led him to question whether he had done the right thing, whether he was doing the right thing. What is the right thing? And if not, what the right thing might have been. But that is not a question that one can answer alone, for ethics deals not with individuals, but with pluralities. And so he began to think from the perspective of the wolf, for whom death by hunting rifle certainly, he would conclude, could not be considered a good. And still more broadly, he began to think like the mountain, to think from the viewpoint of the community as such, which includes not just the deer and not just the wolf, but all the other flora and fauna with whom those ways of being coexist. And in doing so, he seems to have found that his prior commitments were unsettled. If he was once keen to police the boundaries of the land community, expelling anyone or anything that he and the culture deemed dangerous or out of place, he came to see his task eventually as one of caring for the community as such. Leopold came, that is, to care differently. Thinking from a plurality of standpoints, he began to see a plurality of beings and ways of being as worthy of his care and support. Leopold illustrates, in other words, that the wind of thought that unsettles what we took to be true or right or good, although it is inherently destabilizing, that this wind of thought does not in fact foreclose what we might call, following Arendt, judgment. It transforms judgment, to be sure, and perhaps even enriches it. The thinker, although less certain than the non-thinker, goes on making decisions, doing deeds. And Arendt's claim is that the thinker, precisely because they are less certain, less sure of themselves, and so perhaps also less willing to go with the flow, that the thinker is perhaps also likely to make more careful decisions. So here she is at some length on the relationship between thinking and judging. If thinking, which again for her arises out of experience, is experienced as a conversation with oneself, if thinking actualizes the difference within our identity, a kind of inherent plurality in the self, right? She calls it the two in one, as many of you know. If thinking, this conversation with the self, this two in one, actualizes the difference or the plurality within our identity as given in consciousness, and thereby results in conscience as its byproduct, then judging, the byproduct of the liberating effect of thinking, realizes thinking, makes it manifest in the world of appearances where I am never alone and always too busy to be able to think. The activity of thinking, the soundless dialogue that one carries on with oneself, gives rise, she seems to be saying here, to conscience. When we talk to ourselves, Arendt says, we realize that the I is always already a we, and thus that even when I am alone with myself. There's always already two on the scene. And this is for her how consciousness is experienced. And because even when I am alone, I am already with myself, I find that I have a relationship with myself. And this is for her the basis of conscience, a sense of what's good and bad, right and wrong, what I ought to do and what I ought not to do. Since the silent yet present partner is always in some sense waiting for me when I withdraw from the world of appearances, Arendt says that I have to find ways to act, and to act in ways that ensure that I can live with myself, that I can live with the other that is also me. So when I re-enter the world of appearances, the world of politics, which is inhabited by the many, it is my decisions, my judgments, that let my conscience shine forth in the world. And so just as thinking realizes conscience, judging realizes thinking in the world. The quality of our judgments depends then on the quality of our thinking. And for Arendt, who is perhaps attuned above all to the importance of plurality, a special kind of thinking is in order. In her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, and I'm not a Kantian, so if you are a Kantian, help me understand what she's doing with Kant here. I know this is a contested text. At any rate, in her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, which he would not have called a political philosophy as I understand, she gleans from Kant the idea of enlarged mentality. Enlarged mentality. Although every thinker no doubt thinks from a particular position, and though no thinker can truly, Haraway called this like situated knowledge, right? The ways in which we're always situated, and it's only from within those situated spaces. And so here, Arendt, following Kant, is sort of pushing in a slightly different direction, right? So although every thinker thinks from a particular position, a situated place in the world, and though no thinker can truly abandon that position or their place in the world, the idea of enlarged mentality is that we should attempt to see objects or matters or issues from different standpoints, from different perspectives, from many angles. This latter prospect, that we should try to see from different standpoints, is especially important for Arendt. It means that we try to, in her words, take into account the thoughts of others. And she goes on to clarify, it's not just the thoughts of others, but the potential judgments of others that we're trying to wrap our heads around in the thinking activity. But since we cannot know what others are thinking or have thought, we have to call upon other mental faculties, namely the faculty of imagination. So we have to, she says, imaginatively put ourselves in the positions of others so as to imagine how those others might see and experience and think about what is happening. She writes, to think with an enlarged mentality means that one trains one's imagination to go visiting. To think with an enlarged mentality means that one trains one's imagination to go visiting. By considering not the actual but the possible thoughts and judgments of others, the thinker vastly enriches and complicates their own perspective. Thinking with an enlarged mentality, then, is a way of acknowledging and honoring the plurality that is, as Arendt writes elsewhere, the law of the earth. I think there's lots of room to both critique what she's doing here, but also to build on it in productive ways. So, just by way of conclusion, let me go back to Leopold for a moment, and then we can enter into a conversation. In the land ethic, after expanding the notion of community to include more than human others, and after characterizing humans as plain members and citizens of such communities, Leopold turns to what he calls the ecological conscience. It is one thing to say that humans ought to see themselves as bound up with and responsible to more than human others, and it is another to ask what sort of state of mind, what frame of mind can guide or should guide these biotic citizens. Writing in the 1940s, Leopold was worried that even his fellow conservationists, those who seemed most committed to the kinds of ethical and political projects that he was interested in, that even conservationists lacked the ability to think with what Arendt, following Kant, called enlarged mentality. Instead, he notes, people were being taught to, these are his words, obey the law, vote right, join some organizations, and practice what conservation is profitable on your own land, and trust that the government will do the rest. In other words, in place of what Arendt would call thinking and judging, people were being taught to follow rules and adhere to established codes of conduct. Obligations, Leopold writes, have no meaning without conscience, and so the problem we face is the extension of the social conscience from people to land. We ought, in other words, to take the perspective of the others with whom we share the earth into account as we make our decisions, as we judge, and as we act. Doing so does not, of course, ensure that we will make the right decisions, In fact, thinking with an enlarged mentality almost assuredly will complicate our sense that we can determine what the right decisions would at any rate be. But following Leopold, I think it is also the case that by taking the views of as many others as possible into consideration, by respecting the plurality of the earth, we do perhaps at least move in the direction of less rather than more violence. So I'm going to stop there in lieu of a tidier conclusion and just sort of see where this takes us. Okay?
Yeah, thank you so much also for taking us on this journey of thinking and the different facets of thinking and care. We do have time for questions. There are questions, okay. The microphone has already been handed off, so we'll get started right away.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes.
It is.
First thing, I want to say that this morning when I looked at the program, I had no idea at all what rhetoric could say to the topic environmentalism. I'm happy to report I now see that rhetoric can actually contribute quite a lot. But there's one thing I missed in the discussion of Leopold in particular. Most of the examples you gave were talking about human aspects that changed nature. And there were a number of words used around conservation that seemed to imply that you didn't want any changes in the nature. You wanted it to be very static. But nature evolves on its own. The mountain finds itself, eroding. It has landslides. It affects the flow of streams. Other species come in and they evolve over time. And what I was missing was from a rhetoric point of view, is how does the evolution over time from natural processes get addressed? Do we care that nothing changes ever?
Yes, so this is a very good question, and it's one that I've been thinking about and grappling with in the book that I'm writing on, which has to do with invasive species in Pennsylvania and the ways in which various actors who are very invested in protecting this species called the eastern hemlock, it's a native conifer, are engaging in a variety of different caring/harming practices to try to keep the species on this side of the edge of extinction, right? So I guess the thing, and I can come back to that example if people are interested in something more concrete, but I think what matters here, for me anyways, is that one can cast oneself with a whole range of things, right? Leopold, in Thinking Like a Mountain, sort of concludes that, at least on that question, he's going to cast himself with the land community, right? Now, he has a very particular conception of land community in mind, one that is rooted in a particular place and a particular time and a particular understanding of what that ecosystem in what we now call Arizona was like, right? And so he is holding it, right? He wants to hold that landscape in place in time, right? Keep it as he understands it ought to be, right? And so that's the kind of abstraction that I think one can cast oneself with. That's the kind of abstraction that one can let one's care be guided by. But it's not the only one, right? So there are people now who I deeply respect who are really interested in what they're calling variously like novel ecosystems or emergent ecologies, right, who are much more open to acknowledging the fact that we don't live in a world. If we ever did live in a world of pristine landscapes that we could know and that we could sort of map and stabilize, like, I don't think we ever lived in that world. But even if we did, we certainly don't now, right? We live in a world that's sort of messed up in a variety of ways, many times because of human actions. And so the idea of a stable ecosystem that is unchanging is one that even my friends in ecology are pretty happy to do without these days, right? Because they see that it's not actually helping us to understand reality. And so I think that there are different ways. Leopold, you know, in his moment in time, yes, wanted to hold the landscape to a certain idea of what it ought to be. You still see that, right? In Pennsylvania, there's a place called Cook Forest that I'm writing about. It has old-growth eastern hemlocks and white pines. It's magical. It might be the most magical forest I've ever been in. The family that owned the land in the early 1900s worked with activists to preserve it as a state park. And all of the activism from then until now is about holding that place in time, preserving the forest primeval. That's the language, right? So they're casting their lot not with the land community per se as it actually is, but the land community as they want to imagine it. And that's possible. That's a kind of thing one can care about. Whether it's the right thing to care about, I don't know. But it is one thing that one can care about. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
My question somehow is connected to what has just been said. I was very much impressed with your talk. There's not much I can criticize. I very much...
Dankeschön.
No, sorry. I mean, there's one point...
Yeah.
Put it differently.
Yeah.
There's one point where about which I've been thinking very much, and that's the point when you talked about Hannah Arendt. And that's the point when you said that thinking becomes interesting when it's unsettling what's already there. And that's a point. I know that you caught that up somehow, safeguarded by, let's say, talking about individual thinking and so on. But this point of disruption is problematic for me because it can be used politically in all kinds of ways. We know that fascism came in by thinking of it itself as disruptive. Populism thinks itself as disruptive. And so I wonder how you deal with that problematic, that, so to speak, a given order, which might be make sense in terms of ecology, politics, and so on, how the feeling of disruption, of change, is maybe not extremely dangerous. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Can you say the last word one more time?
No.
Okay.
It can be really dangerous.
Dangerous, yeah. I mean, so I want to go to Arendt first, because she addresses the question, right, in The Life of the Mind and to a certain extent in the essay Thinking and Moral Considerations. And towards the end of the thinking section of The Life of the Mind, she says that kind of famous line that all thinking has a sort of undermining effect, right? And so she thinks that thinking is always perilous. It is always dangerous. And she says part of why it's always dangerous is that it is equally dangerous to all creeds, and it doesn't produce any new creed, right? So long as I'm thinking, I'm not coming up with any kind of new belief system. I'm not necessarily coming up with another value system. It's really impractical, right? Now, I think that she would probably, and you all can help me here because you probably know better, I think she would say that the way in which fascism or populism, or as someone else pointed out to me not too long ago and talking about this stuff like the anti-vaxxing kind of stuff, which purports to be the product of thoughtfulness. Right now, I think Arendt would say that's not thoughtfulness. These are claims made upon us, right? In fact, by unthinking people who have the preservation of some kind of interest in mind, right? And so I think it gets complicated for that reason. I don't know if what I'm trying to say is making sense. She has a very particular conception of thinking, which I'm trying to work with here in mind, that would forbid me from sort of thinking about some of the examples that you've given and that other friends have given me as thinking. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to make this very short. Thank you very much for your talk, Joshua. I really appreciated how carefully you outlined the dilemma of caring in our present conditions for us. And if I understood you correctly, the question we're trying to get at was, how can we care? How can we begin to care for others? And you were going at it by way of how can we begin to take other perspectives into account? How can we integrate them? How can we change our way of thinking? And that brought you over to Arendt. And I think my problem is with Arendt's account of thinking. Because at the end of the day, and you actually admitted it, right? So I'm curious to see where this is going. It's way too, well, I could say idealistic, but also too rational and too abstract, the way she thinks that thinking works. Oh, okay. Bear with me for a second. The first part of your talk very persuasively showed the bodily component of what we're looking at, the phenomenon, right? Care is grounded in affect, in feeling as well. So I was wondering whether there's any way that you could come up with a more sort of bodily way of thinking, one that does not believe so much in the idea that we can, I'm thinking of Leopold, who retrospectively fashioned this narrative. Yeah. And I have to say, I'm not a fan of Leopold. I'm a fan of the wolf, and every time I read this passage, I'm actually crying. So he retroactively fashioned this narrative, and it's beautiful, and I'm happy for Mr. Leopold that he changed his ways. But can we perhaps spare the lives of wolves to change our way of thinking in the future? So can we find a concept of thinking that's more along the ways of habit? Because we are habitual creatures. I'm thinking of pragmatist philosophy, perhaps. So you see, I've used my 3 minutes. It's a jumble of thoughts, and I apologize for that. But since your work seems to be so feels for me very important, I just want to give that to you and see maybe you can do something with it. Thank you very much.
I don't think I can. Thank you for that. That's a tangle, a beautiful tangle, and I can't address it all. I do want to say. Maybe one thing, I sort of cocked my head a little bit when you described Arendt's version of thinking as too abstract. And I want to say that I think, in fact, that you're sort of partially right in my view, particularly in these conversations about our relationships with the more than human, right? Part of what's so frustrating to me about her discussion of thinking in the life of the mind and then enlarged mentality in the lectures on Kant's political philosophy, she does it very quickly there, right, is that she doesn't seem to take into account the fact that, at least among human communities, that we can actually, she does talk about this elsewhere, we actually do talk to one another. We expose ourselves to one another. And so I don't simply have to imagine what's in your mind, right? We can converse. And of course she writes so beautifully about plurality and conversation and persuasion. And so it's interesting to me in that moment that she doesn't take that into account. That being said, and this is why I think that the example from Leopold is so very important, I don't know that it's quite so easy, right, to have those kinds of exchanges with more than human others. Leopold was really good at it because he spent all day, every day outside, listening and paying attention to the birds, listening and paying attention to the other animals that he was dwelling with. He entered into, in his way of thinking, a kind of conversation with these other ways of being. Now, whether he understood them, that's another question. But he at least sort of had this kind of experience. So I think on the one hand, it's too abstract for me when we're talking about how do we relate to and think with other human people. But it is very helpful, I think, for when we're trying to grapple with what it would mean to take into account the perspective of radically different others, where we might actually have to truly fashion a perspective. And we have to do so without any self-assurance that we are getting it right. Leopold's making a leap when he's presuming to sort of have figured out what the mountain would like, what the mountain would experience as caring. And maybe he's right? But maybe also he's not. So yeah, it's all muddled for me, yeah.
A direct follow-up question Thank you so much for your inspiring talk. I was also wondering whether you could take this conceptualization of Arendt of the two into one more concretely into the 21st century culture and maybe politics also, because if this communion with oneself is seen as a precondition to enter into community with others, to take on standpoints of others, I wonder whether this is precisely what has gotten so incredibly difficult these days. Because there are so few moments where one is with oneself and has the quietude to enter into this communion, because one is always already inundated by all these other judgments around oneself, be it via social media or the crowds one is in and so on. So whether that has almost become an impossibility, which is why it has become so difficult to enter into a real relationship with others.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and probably my colleagues who do like media studies and these kinds of things might be a little better equipped to think about how the particular media ecology in which many of us dwell today affects our capacities to think. But I also, at some point I want to write more complicatedly about Arendt, because I also don't think she's quite right on this either. I think so we're all here together, right? In this room. There are a million distractions, not the least of which is me babbling on up here at the front of the room, but there are people around you fidgeting, your phone is dinging in your pocket. There are all of these claims upon your attention. And yet I found myself over the last day and a half, occasionally, even while someone is up here doing their thing, I think I was thinking. Right? Now, those moments can be fleeting, and they are very different from the sort of, if you all probably know the very famous interview with Arendt, the Günter Gauss interview, and she's kind of talking about how she thinks. She's like sits around and thinks, and she won't put anything down onto paper until she can dictate it to herself. And so there's this idea that she has these very prolonged periods of thoughtfulness, right? That she's lying on the couch, smoking cigarette after cigarette, thinking, and then she's suddenly not thinking again. And yet I think in everyday life, for me anyways, I feel that I experience this activity of thinking in sometimes those durational ways, but often very fleetingly. So I think you're right that thinking is very difficult in our sort of pan-mediated ecology, but I don't think it's impossible. And I do hope that we can find ways to maybe expand upon those little moments that we have from time to time, if that makes, yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. I have a question that maybe follows a little bit after Stephanie's. And the simple version of the question is, how do we know when any other is thinking? And I'm not saying others are not thinking, but how do we know? And I'm thinking both of human others and of other than human others, whether mountains or stars or wolves. How does one know?
Yeah.
And I'll just stop there.
So, I don't know, to be frank with you, but I'll bullshit a bit. So, sort of following Arendt, I think when we're amongst other humans, right, one of the ways that we know, or one of the ways that we can feel relatively sure that others are thinking is that we talk to one another, right? And through talking to one another, through communicating with one another, through trying to persuade one another, et cetera, we reveal ourselves as judging beings who have made certain kinds of judgments about how things are or should be, and that judging comes out of a thinking process. So that would be one way. Now, I don't know if that's right or not, but I think that that's one way to answer the question about how do we know other humans are thinking or capable of thinking. I don't know that we can know, for example, that a mountain is thinking, and I don't know that it's important for the kind of question that at least Leopold was interested in asking and trying to answer. I think for him it was, in a way, like, what if we imagined that the mountain was thinking? What if we imagined that the mountain had a perspective on its own existence? What if we imagine that the mountain has a standpoint, a viewpoint, right, about what happens on and in and near and amongst the community that it gathers together? and what would it mean to fashion such a perspective in my own mind and then try to be responsive to it. Rather than thinking of the mountain, the other alternative, or one other alternative, is just to think of it as inert matter, right? Not only unthinking, but also uncaring in the sense that the mountain would have no cares. It doesn't care whether it's denuded and erodes and so on and so forth.
So the follow-up question, though, is if we care about, if we know that others are thinking about conversation, and thinking is the fundamental value, then that actually radically limits those with whom we're in a caring relation, because we only know those with whom we're in conversation.
Okay, sorry, can I just interrupt you because there's 3 more questions on the list and we're already running up against time, so maybe you can continue that part of the conversation in the coffee break. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'd like to complicate your notions about Germans and what they do with their life a little bit. So,
please.
You seem to think that we somehow start our day reading Arendt and then end our day with reading a couple of chapters in Kant. This is not the case.
No?
But coming back to your talk, I think you were moving on such an abstract level about thinking and how we arrive at judgments and that we have to somehow put ourselves into the position of others, which we discussed yesterday also in connection with empathy, that I'm wondering how do we translate this into the performance and practice of environmental citizenship? How do we somehow adapt this or apply this to the situation in the 21st century, especially since you somehow argued, and your whole argument rests on somehow the idea of universal categorical imperatives, like we ought to protect the environment in a time and context where we are disputing universalisms of all kind. And again, coming back to what we already started yesterday, I mean, how do we justify that we ought to care for the environment in a discussion where people may dispute this very fact? Thinking of Ronald Reagan, who said, well, what has nature ever done for me? So there we are in the field of somehow political discourse, there we are in the field of power struggles, and there we are in the field of communication with people who may not share the very premises of our thinking. So this whole idea of somehow universal categorical imperatives in a situation, in a context where we are disputing exactly the universalisms of all kinds.
Okay, thank you. So I did not mean to suggest that there is some sort of universal imperative, right, that we ought to protect the environment. What I'm trying to do, I think, is to begin from the perspective that we are caring beings. Humans are caring beings, and I've just argued in some other writing that we're not the only caring beings, but I think we're on solid ground in thinking about humans as caring beings, so long as we understand caring as ontologically plural, right? And can say more about that if people want, but we do care, and we have cares, and so it matters with whom and with what we care. Now, I'm not trying to propose, certainly not trying to propose that we all need to care in the same way. And in fact, that's why I think like the example of Leopold is very important. It's also why I've been doing work on invasive species where people do in fact care. It turns out people care about a whole lot of different things under the guise of caring for the environment. Like caring for the environment doesn't really mean anything to me. I want to know like which species, which beings, which places, which ecosystems, and how, and why, and with what consequences, right? Like what are the methods? Is spraying pesticides on trees that have non-native insects in them caring? Lots of people think that it is. They don't seem to mind, right, that it might have these sort of downstream effects that affect not just the bugs that they dislike, but other insects and so on and so forth. And yet it is presented under this sort of guise of caring. So I hope not to have given you the impression that I think that there is some kind of universal imperative that we all just need to get in line with, but that in fact that the kind of thinking which Leopold is engaged in and the kind of thinking which Arendt tries to theorize is precisely the sort of thinking that would kind of stabilize that sense that there could be or should be one way forward. And so where Arendt ends up, and this is one of the connections to rhetoric is traditionally, understood as the art of persuasion, right? And so after all this talk about thinking and judging and so on and so forth, Arendt says, well, then we have to come back into the world of appearance with other people. We have to engage in politics and so on and so forth. And part of what we do is we try, she says we have to woo other people. We have to woo them, or we have to try to woo them. We have to talk to them and to try to convince them to take up a particular perspective or to engage in a particular kind of politics or ethics. And so, yeah, it's not universal for me. It's highly, the way this actually plays out in lived experience, I think, is highly particular and contextual. And if it is to become bigger than that, right? If it is to scale up, then it requires these kinds of persuasive processes rather than mandates or commands or things from on high. You have to woo, yes.
Thank you very much for a beautiful talk, and also thanks for introducing the notion of uncertainty to us. But my question, or rather two, sorry, Linda, go in a different direction. One riffs on the question of ethics, that the empathy was, which was introduced yesterday. And I was wondering whether, because empathy would mean potential community on the basis of feeling with, and what you're offering here via Leopold and Arendt is rather thinking with, thinking as, thinking like. Mm-hmm. Would you consider this to some extent compatible, or are these conflicting notions of how we might develop relations of care? So, and connected to that for me is the question, you used Leopold's phrase member and citizen again, time and again throughout your talk. And I'm wondering, being a member of a community, does that automatically make us morally obligated and hence enter into the realm of what is denoted by citizenship here? Thank you.
Yeah. Part of what's complicated about that phrase and Leopold, and then the way he sort of plays it out in the land ethic, is he doesn't really elaborate what constitutes membership, right? He seems to suppose that, again, that land communities are kind of identifiable, right? And these were ideas that were popular in ecology at the time, right? That ecosystems were identifiable, and that there were certain animals and plants and so on and so forth that inhabited those ecosystems, and that it was their rightful sort of place in the world, right? And that they have a kind of belonging in that place. And I think that was probably wrong then to a certain extent, and it's certainly wrong now when we have so much movement and migration, right, across ecosystems, which unsettles those ecosystems and recomposes them. Right? And so things are constantly shifting and changing. So I just want to put that there, right? That there's a question for me about how we think about that question of membership and participation. Is it for someone like Leopold static, right? Or would Leopold be able to accept, for example, that there might be newcomers, refugees? Right, I think Arendt could help us to think through this, right? That there might be newcomers, climate refugees, who are not only human, but more than human as well, that are moving. So what does that do to our sense of the community? And can we be capacious enough, generous enough to embrace not only with hostility, but also with hospitality, those newcomers? The question of empathy is very interesting. I think at one point, and I'd have to go back, maybe your partner knows, I'd have to go back to the Arendt, but I think at one point, either she or one of the commentators that I've read also describes this as a kind of empathetic thinking, right? As opposed to what Arendt calls, I think, in the Denktag books, like tyrannical thinking, right? So even Arendt, I think, was maybe gesturing towards the possibilities of empathy. One person who has done some of this work is Laurie Gruen, who comes at some of these questions about care more, as I understand it, from a kind of animal studies perspective, and wrote this book called Entangled Empathy, right? So it begins with the fact we're these relational entangled beings, and that as such we have certain responsibilities to care for these other beings with whom we are entangled, and that, well, how do you know what kind of care would be good for, say, the cat that you live with or the bird in your yard? Well, you have to try to empathize with them and feel and understand from their perspective, and that then you can be caring. I like her book, but I think that she gets some things very wrong. For example, I don't think entanglement is a very good way to think about why we owe one another care, for example. We're entangled with all sorts of things that we don't care for. So just realistically, it doesn't tell us why we do, in fact, care for some things rather than others.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I think it was very resonant with many of the topics that we've discussed over the last 2 days, be it empathy, be it civil disobedience, be it, various issues. So my question is really only a very small question, and that is related to the beginning of your talk when you introduced Leopold, and I wanted to go back there and hear a little bit more about how you historicize Leopold's intervention in his own sort of historical moment. So what was he up against? I'm thinking, of course, Roosevelt. I'm thinking about other discourses of conservation in the time. I'm thinking about also maybe a different view on nature, or more, if you will, utilitarian view. And could you say a bit more about that historical context for us better to understand sort of the important intervention, really, that he made in his day and age?
Yeah. I'll try, but I'm not a historian, and so I'll try to maybe say a few things that are helpful to know. One thing that I think is really important to know, or to think with, or grapple with in Leopold's writing, is that he, at least in a Sand County Almanac, right, and in some of his other writings as well, he seems pretty oblivious to the indigenous history of North America, right? So he, although he's very cautious about, he's very sort of worried about writing the land ethic, right? Because he says no ethic should be written, he says, right? Because it is this sort of thing that has to evolve over. So he's very cautious about wanting to put down into words, a statement about how we ought to live. And in doing so, he sort of doesn't really talk about the ways in which the sorts of ideas that he's working with have been circulating, right, in different ways, in different cultures, and so on and so forth. So I think that piece is important. He's also, by his own account anyways, he's also feeling that he's working within a context, and hearing some of the talks over the last few days, I can't help but feel that this, in many ways, is still the context in which we find ourselves, right, where kind of economic imperatives rule, right, that conservation at the time is really guided, in his view anyways, by government and by economic claims upon us, right, to profitability. And so I think in his mind, that's largely what he's working against, is how do you fashion a way of approaching the world? How do you fashion a way of seeing oneself in relation with others that doesn't begin and end with economic questions? He's not immune to them, right? In that line that I read, he says it's about what's ethical, what's aesthetic, and what's economically expedient. So he's not immune to those questions, but he thinks that there has to be like vital supplements to them that will keep us from, that could have kept us, maybe in his mind at the time, from being in the situation that we are now, right? So he's writing right on the cusp of what people now call the Great Acceleration. Like he's writing right at the beginning of the period in which all of those graphs, right, go. And he had a kind of sense that was coming, and I think hoped that he could intervene in some way into that, but that it would require a shift in conscience. I don't know that it was entirely new in the way that people have taken it up, right? But I think that that's what he thought he was responding to.
All right. I apologize to anyone who didn't get to ask the question. There's always the coffee break. Thank you so much for a wonderful and very engaging presentation. Thank you for your engagement in the room, and enjoy some coffee. Thank you.